I'm Emily Mashak, and you're listening to Tuned Into NoCo, Town Square Media's show that lets you know what matters in NoCo. I'm talking today with Fort Collins Police Services Officer Annie Hill and Stephanie Booco, the UC Health Community Programs Coordinator and Clinician, about FCPS's new mental health response team. So thank you so much for joining me today, ladies.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Of course. Now, before we get into the MHRT, I want to talk a little bit about each of you. I'll start with you, Officer Annie. What brought you to the Fort Collins Police Services?
So I actually used to work in residential treatment. I was a counselor for at-risk teenage girls, and I did that for almost 3 years. And I was at the point where I just decided that I wanted to do something bigger and kind of reach out more to a different, to more of the population. And I ended up falling into police work, and I was from Minnesota and ended up wanting to go towards Colorado because of the 300 days of sunshine a year. And I researched Fort Collins, and one of the big things I learned about Fort Collins was their approach on community policing. And that's what really drew me to the agency. I did a community policing presentation on Fort Collins PD, applied, got hired, and here I am.
That is awesome. And how about you, Stephanie? How did you find your way to UC Health?
I've worked in a variety of settings in terms of just my clinical work in the past. And the big thing that I found was that by the time people got to me, I really couldn't affect the trajectory of their care too much. And so that's kind of how I fell into co-response. Was I found that this would be the best way for me to contact people at the beginning of any potential healthcare or legal involvement and help them to really get to the right care at the right time in the right place. And that's just well aligned with UC Health's mission. So that's kind of how I landed here.
On to the mental health response team. Clearly, it has to do with mental health, but what actually is it and how did it come to be?
Great question. So Fort Collins Police Services is in my opinion, as a clinician, a very innovative department. And they identified a need for some type of support to the officers in terms of mental health, behavioral health, that type of thing, actually all the way back in 2015. And they worked really hard to find partnerships and funding to actually get this off the ground. And in 2018 is when they were actually able to do that. So I've worked with them since the inception of the program back then, and we actually launched it as a traditional co-response model. So just a clinician and an officer riding around, taking calls, trying to divert people from the emergency department and the jail. And what we actually found in the process of all of that, and as we were gathering our data, was that we found it would be really beneficial to have a community paramedic join our team. A community paramedic is a paramedic that has at least 5 years of experience, and they've done additional training and education and testing to demonstrate the higher level of competency, I guess you could say, to do a wider range of medical interventions. So they help us out on scene with whether it's field medical stability assessments or just checking, doing like a medication reconciliation, fall risk assessment. Other things that we were finding were common needs shared by our patients that had mental health or substance use needs. So in 2020, we added a community paramedic to our team. And then this year we have the 2 officers that just joined us.
I mean, I think really as of recent, with the addition of having 2 officers, prior to having 2 dedicated officers, Stephanie would ride with various cops on the street that were really dedicated to, handling calls that were secondary to mental illness. And the department saw the need for having dedicated cops that were just out working with Stephanie and really dedicated to follow up, because I think that's important too, not just handling stuff in the moment of a crisis, but being able to call, 3 days later, a week later, to see how that person's doing and check in.
Right. Would you be able to expand on that a little bit more? What exactly are the specific goals of the MHRT?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, our specific goals, in the moment, acutely, having that officer safety, the scene safety for everybody involved, the person in crisis, the public, whatever it may be, that would be the acute moment, and getting that person stabilized, whether it's where they're at their home or wherever they may be, or transporting them to the ER, or whatever is the most appropriate. And so the follow-up piece, so our goal is to get them referred in some type of service where they aren't, necessarily, it's not a police issue. It's not, a 911 issue. We want to get them some type of care that is long-term for them.
And now, in both of your experiences, how big of an issue is mental health in the Fort Collins community?
That's a really good question. So from a clinical perspective, I can at least kind of point to some of the data that we saw with the pandemic. So when the pandemic set in initially about this time last year, we saw a 450% increase in calls related to mental health and suicide-related calls, whether that was threats or attempts, that type of thing. We saw that double. So that's just one piece of how we've kind of seen just the political climate and socio climate that we're living in right now affect people's mental health. I mean, we've seen a lot of uncertainty and that type of thing. So that's one thing that we've seen. But even prior to the pandemic, I mean, if you go on these calls, you'll find it's not uncommon for there to be a mental health component in them. Because typically when we get on scene, it's not people's best day. They're having a really difficult time. They might be dysregulated because they're dealing with something that they don't normally deal with. So whether it's just helping somebody with the anxiety or stress of the initial call, or if we go out and we find, wow, this family or this individual could really benefit from some additional support in the home, whether maybe that's like home health or kind of following their case until they're able to find a good therapist that they really feel comfortable with, that type of thing. So for example, I mean, we'll go out and we'll visit with somebody, kind of make sure that they're all taken care of in the moment. And then, we'll give them a call a week later and say, hey, how are you doing? Do you want to go get a coffee? Is there anything we can do for you? How did those referrals work out? We really focus on ensuring that people are actually not just being given pamphlets, but they're getting to really good resources and actually engaging with them.
So is that how you think kind of that more long-term checking in? Is that how you think the MHRT will change the way that mental health calls are handled?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Stephanie is a really great example of, she connects them to the services and then follows up with those services, gets a release of information in place so we can make sure that the right connections are being made. Because some people say, yeah, I went there, but I didn't necessarily, it didn't relate to me and I didn't feel like this was as beneficial for me specifically. Stephanie can get them connected to whatever therapeutic services they may need. And then we have people who, what we call our, high utilizers, because they rely on 911 because they're not really sure where to go. So when we work with those people, 911 is not, everybody is recognized. 911 is not maybe the best route for them to take. Stephanie will get them connected to maybe whether it's a crisis line when they're feeling that moment of crisis, or a direct therapist or caseworker that they can connect with, as opposed to calling 911 and getting maybe an officer or, an ambulance.
Now, I think there's a lot of misconceptions out there about stuff like this. And Stephanie, I saw in the press release, you mentioned that the MHRT is a better option than sending out only a social worker or something like that. And I think a lot of people are under the impression that sending out a social worker might be the answer. Can you expand on that and explain a little bit more why we might need a higher level of service as opposed to just sending out a social worker?
Absolutely. And thank you for the question, because I get this all the time. So I kind of frame it up this way. When people call 911, they have made a decision that whatever they're dealing with in this moment is kind of outside of their hands to some extent, and they need support. Oftentimes when we get the call, people are just calling for help and they're giving us the best information that they can, but they may be just under so much distress in the moment that they may not be able to give us a full story, or things may change before we get on scene. And that's really not uncommon. I mean, they talk about how scenes are dynamic and things can change. And I've seen it a lot in my time here. For example, when I first got started, I think I was probably a month into working here. And when we don't have any mental health calls, we'll take any other calls to just help out the patrol cops and that type of thing, and making sure people are getting timely service. And so there wasn't any mental health calls holding. We went out to help somebody that had been a victim of an assault. And while the officer was beginning to start her investigation, we heard footsteps pounding up the stairs. And then this person shouldered their way through the door, lifted up their shirt and exposed their waistband. And I could have sworn I saw a gun. Apparently it was just a large knife from what the officer told me. But in that moment, I would have had no options if she weren't there. A lot of times we're dressed as civilians. And so we go in and people don't really know who we are compared to everybody else. So that's just kind of an example of just how quickly things can change. And the fact that you're dealing with crisis. With crisis, oftentimes you're seeing people that are feeling a little bit more impulsive. They're dysregulated. They're unable to completely think straight, that type of thing. And if you added any kind of substance use, which we see, at least 75% of the time, I would say on average with our calls, that further increases, emotional lability and impulsivity, that type of thing. So I think really for safety, it's really important to have that officer just there. And really when the officers respond, they aren't in the middle of my conversation. They'll take a step back, they'll give us some space, that type of thing. So we still have some privacy. The other piece is that it's also nice to have an officer there in case I need to be protected or helped. There's plenty of times that I respond on scene and people are completely besides themselves, whether that's because they're in the midst of, say, like a major mood episode or because they're acutely impaired by a substance and they're just not thinking straight. Maybe they're seeing and hearing things. Oftentimes I need the officers there too to help support me and make sure that I'm safe and I can too go home to my family. I think what we saw in Seattle with that case manager that unfortunately lost her life and going out to checking in on somebody, we're going to see more of that if we're not intentional with what we're doing.
Right. Well, thank you so much for that answer. I think that will provide a lot of clarity. How can listeners reach out to specifically the MHRT if they ever need to, or how can they specify that they need extra mental health services with their call?
So if you're calling either the 911 or the non-emergency number because you have, some issue and you would like to seek services right then and there, then you can request MHRT through our dispatch or our call taker. If it's something that you just wanted to reach out to MHRT, that is something that you could send an email to the department. I believe on our Fort Collins Police webpage, there's a mental health drop down of services that are offered through Fort Collins Police, and it will show you how to connect to our team. I believe it's MHRT@fcgov.com would be the email address.
And now clearly mental health issues are very complicated, but in general, with both of your backgrounds in mental health work, what would your advice be for listeners who may be struggling with their mental health right now, especially in the midst of the pandemic?
Great question. I think the big thing is you're not alone. We're all dealing with this to some extent in our lives. The data also shows that at some point in our lives, 1 in 5 people are going to experience some type of depression or something like that would warrant clinical attention or talking to a therapist. And just thinking about everything that's going on in our world right now, it is not uncommon to feel anxious, to feel depressed, to maybe have some issues with sleep, that type of thing. So know you're not alone. Know that there are resources and that there's people that care and want to hear your story and what your needs are, and they want to meet them. I think that's a big thing for me. Annie, how do you see it?
Yeah, and I know that there's definitely a big, stigma around police right now, but I can speak to our officers in Northern Colorado. There are a lot of officers here that are really just great at talking to people, so if you're in a moment where you just are beside yourself and not really sure what to do, you can always call 911, and I can guarantee that the officer on scene is actually going to get you to the appropriate place that you need to be, whether it's, the hospital to talk to somebody, give you the contact information for the crisis line. There are officers that are willing and able to talk to people if that's what they're in need of.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, ladies, for taking the time to talk to me today. It has been so great to learn about the MHRT. Is there anything else that you would like listeners to know?
No, just that we're always open to feedback, so they can reach us at that email address. They can also catch us on Facebook and Instagram. We have a really great public information officer here at FCPS that we work very closely with, and we always want the feedback. This is a program that's for the community and by the community, so the more that we can tailor it to the needs of our community and really provide the best service possible, that's where our interest lies.
Thank you both so much, ladies. I appreciate it.
Thanks. Have a great day.
Again, that was Officer Annie Hill and Stephanie Booco talking about the new mental health response team with the Fort Collins Police Services. Learn more at fcgov.com/police/mental-health.